Good evening, everyone. We're going to give it a few moments here and let our attendees join in. And so give us a few moments, please. All right. Well, I think we've got everybody here. Good evening. I'm Councilwoman Stacie Gilmore, and thank you for joining us for the Wage Theft Enforcement Informational Town Hall. We're delighted to have you here with us this evening. This is the second town hall we've hosted, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Council President Torres to introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jamie Torres. I'm proud to represent West Denver District 3, and I'm one of the co-sponsors of this bill.
Good evening, everybody. Candi CdeBaca, and I represent District 9, and I'm a co-sponsor of this bill as well.
Good evening, everyone. Amanda Sawyer. I represent District 5 and also proud co-sponsor. Thanks so much for being here.
All right. And we also have Jeff Garcia with the Auditor's Office.
Thanks, Councilwoman Gilmore. Yeah, we're here to answer questions.
All right, glad to have you here. And then we also have our city attorney who works with City Council. And so we'll go ahead and allow him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Councilwoman. CdeBaca, Assistant City Attorney's Office.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us. And we're going to move on to some housekeeping just to give you the flow of tonight's webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about how did we get here? What is wage theft? Why is this a priority in Denver? And what will this proposed legislation do? And then we'll have question and answer time as well. And we will try to answer as many questions as we possibly can. And anything that we can't answer tonight, we'll make sure and get addressed and answer via email. We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the process that has brought us to this point in time. And way back in the spring of 2019, the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades and Colorado Jobs with Justice reached out to Councilmember then Lopez, now he's our clerk and recorder, but reached out to Councilmember Lopez and myself and wanted to express their concerns about wage theft in Denver. And in the summer of 2019, myself and Council President Torres and Councilwoman Sawyer kicked off the stakeholder process to explore a wage bond. And then in the fall of 2019, we looked into what the current process is at the state, where the city could possibly help with efficiencies. And we also looked at other municipalities' legislation. And then in 2020, we continued that work with stakeholders, and Councilwoman Sawyer, very grateful to her. She stepped in to lead the process when I was elected as council president in July of 2020. And at that point, the stakeholder group had come to the consensus that they weren't going to explore a wage bond at that point in time. And then in further conversations in 2021, we started really looking at the drafting possibilities to include our stakeholders' policy priorities. And they really wanted inclusion of independent contractors, up the chain liability, and badging on public projects. And then in the spring of this year, we decided to build on the minimum wage structure that was already set up in the city and worked with stakeholders to accomplish the policy goals within that already established framework. And then this fall, we have finalized the draft legislation and have been sharing it with employers and the public. And this winter, we're in the legislative process, and this is part of what's been a very robust stakeholder engagement process starting way back in 2019. And in 2023, with the adoption, hopefully, of this legislation, we'll work with the planned implementation and then have the auditor, they probably will have to grow their capacity and establish a complaint procedure and then begin enforcement in 2023 once that's all set up. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Councilwoman CdeBaca.
Awesome. Thank you. I just, I want to dive into the problem, but we have a couple of folks available to talk about their story to illustrate the problem for us. And I wanted to make sure we have interpretation here for our first storyteller, Ernesto Fonseca. Do we have translation?
Yeah, someone from the Colorado Jobs with Justice team is going to be able to translate.
Awesome. Well, then I will kick it over to Ernesto, who is a member of the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, and he will tell us a little bit about his story of wage theft. Ernesto, are you able to hear us?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
Looks like we can hear you. Your mic is on. You can go ahead and tell us your story.
Si ya está listo, compañero Ernesto, y puede hablar y compartir su historia.
Sí, más que estaba fallando la señal. Ah, pues, hola, pues mi nombre es Ernesto Fonseca Landeros. Yo fui empleado de la compañía SNOR y pues yo trabajé ahí un buen tiempo. A nosotros ahí trabajábamos todos por hora, pero a nosotros nos pedían tener aseguranza como y compañía. Todos nosotros no sabíamos, nosotros pensábamos que era algo normal. Y pues ya hasta que después conocimos a Cándido y a otras personas que nos hicieron pláticas, nos abrieron, pues nos dieron así como pláticas y así como así pues nos abrieron los ojos pues de que eso no era bien y todo eso y eso estaba mal porque ellos nos trabajábamos muchas horas, más de 40 horas y nos pagaban lo mismo y nosotros no sabíamos que eso estaba bien. Y aparte tampoco sabíamos de que teníamos que tener una compañía y una aseguranza y trabajar por horas hasta que ellos nos dieron pláticas y todo y hicieron razón y por eso es que decidí hacer esto.
¿Ya terminó, compañero Ernesto? ¿Le puedo compartir en inglés?
Sí.
Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Ernesto, and I used to be an employer of the company called SNR. In this company, we worked by the hour. We were required to have insurance and a company status. We thought that this was normal. However, it wasn't until we came into contact with Candido, the community organizer from IUPAT, the Painters Union, and having sustained relationships and conversations about our rights as workers, we realized that how we were getting treated was not okay, and also it shouldn't be the norm. We were able to then realize that we should not have to work 40 hours plus with the same pay. We also realized that it shouldn't have been necessary for us to have individual insurance and to have a company status. It wasn't until after we were able to have serious conversations with the IUPAD organizers that we were able to come forward and share this story in a way where we were able to organize long-term and advocate for our rights as workers.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. So as you heard, wage theft happens when a worker is paid less than the full wages to which they're legally entitled. And there's a range of different ways that could happen, including failing to pay the non-exempt employees less than time and a half for hours worked in excess of 40 hours, off the clock violations where employees are asked to work off the clock before or after their shifts, meal break violations where workers are not allowed their legally mandated breaks, illegal deductions, employee misclassification violations. That's misclassifying employees as independent contractors so that they can pay a wage lower than the minimum or to avoid paying overtime entirely. We have another story from Daniel Sosa before I dive a little deeper. So Daniel's also a member of the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, and he is a Spanish speaker, so he will be sharing his story in Spanish, and we will have Jillian interpreting afterwards. So Daniel, please share.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon. Hola, ¿pueden escucharme?
Sí.
Ok. Bueno, pues también ya lo había comentado el compañero Ernesto, pues nosotros fuimos una de las víctimas que pues fuimos engañados por parte de la compañía Arsenal Contractor y asociados que pues como lo está diciendo, pues hablaba sobre asociaciones de que pues éramos contratistas junto con la compañía. El problema era que nosotros, como lo dijo el compañero, pagábamos aseguranzas, teníamos que meter horas para modo de que pudiéramos salir con un sueldo digno porque teníamos un sueldo demasiado bajo. Fuimos también víctimas de discriminación, hubo compañeros que eran de preferencia sexual y pues eran discriminados por esos problemas. También sufrimos lo que fue también mucho problema de problemas con los sueldos más que nada. La verdad no fue, ¿cómo me puedo explicar aquí? La verdad, lo que a mí no me pareció fue que cuando teníamos problemas ya fuera de salud o cosas así, accidentes en el trabajo, a nosotros no se nos brindaba ningún tipo de apoyo. Se suponía que si éramos contratistas con la compañía, ellos tenían que pagarnos overtime, teníamos que tener supuestamente una mejor cobertura para modo de que pues nos cubrieran daños físicos o cualquier accidente, lo que fuera, pero no, o sea, no se nos daba ningún tipo de apoyo o indemnización, nada. Igual para los impuestos, también pues prácticamente pues nosotros teníamos que pagar nuestros impuestos con bajos sueldos. Era algo que no estaba, la verdad, nada bien para supuestamente personas que pues estábamos trabajando con contratos. Cuando llegó la unión, Cándido, la verdad se nos explicaron muchas cosas y pues abrieron los ojos, ¿no? Porque muchas de estas compañías lo que hacen es de que se aprovechan por el estatus migratorio que tiene uno. El IT number, lo que a ellos les interesaba era que nosotros tuviéramos IT number, porque así nosotros pagábamos las taxas, nos explicaban así más o menos de cómo estaba el trabajo, pero no nos enseñaban las pautas de los contratos que nosotros firmábamos, porque nada más nos decían, firma aquí porque vas a ser de la compañía, pero no tienes derecho de que si te sales de este plan de trabajo, de esta compañía, no puedes llevarte a tus compañeros porque te metes en problemas legales. Muchas cosas sucedieron en esa compañía. También tuve dos ocasiones, tuve 2 accidentes de trabajo. Yo me tuve que hacer responsable con, pues, prácticamente mi servicio médico y no se me pagó ningún día de trabajo, nada, o sea, por completo. Como le comento también, tuvimos compañeros que se les faltó al respeto por el caso de tener, pues, preferencias sexuales. La verdad, o sea, fue una compañía que hizo muy mal y pues me da mucho gusto que ahorita se debata esto y que se vea que no es, que pues uno como persona que pues no es legalmente aquí, pues tenemos derechos, ¿no? Que tenemos asociaciones como la Unión que pues ayuda a los trabajadores a tener un mejor nivel de vida, de que se respeten también los salarios, porque la verdad anteriormente como pintores pues no estábamos siendo demasiado evaluados, nos tomaban como que menos en cuenta, como que nuestro trabajo era muy fácil, pero no, o sea, en realidad ser pintores pues implica mucho la responsabilidad y también pues confianza de muchas personas y pues me da mucho gusto que pues que ahora se haya puesto este alto con estas compañías abusivas que pues abusan de la confianza y del respeto de uno y pues que pues tratan de pasar sobre encima de pues de muchas situaciones y pues la verdad pues este fue un caso de que la compañía Arsenal, pues al igual que muchas, se han estado beneficiando con, pues, con la comunidad latina, no nada más la latina, sino que pues por el estatus migratorio que tiene uno, ¿no? Y eso es lo que, pues le doy muchas gracias a la Unión, que pues la verdad sí ha trabajado muy bien y pues a base de eso pues hemos tenido ya pues buenos salarios, hemos sido más tomados en cuenta, también pues se nos dio una buena indemnización por los accidentes y por toda la mala experiencia que tuvimos en esta compañía.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Daniel Sosa. I also, as my coworker Ernesto shared, I worked for SNR contractors. And as he described, we were considered independent contractors. However, we had to obtain our own insurance. We had to work long hours, and we had to mandatorily wear the uniform of the company. Aside from the poor treatment that we got, there was also a lot of discrimination and harassment that we experienced and that our other peers experienced. And this is due to their sexual identity of identifying as part of the LGBTQ community. There was constant harassment. And in addition to the wages that were stolen, we also had injuries or health issues because of the workplace and the lack of safety. We were forced to work overtime and were not paid over for that. We were also unable to obtain any kind of support or coverage from the company, particularly when we became injured at the place of work. We basically had no support and felt like we had no voice. It wasn't until we came in contact with IUPAT and the conversations that we had that we were able to realize that we had rights regardless of our immigration status, that we had rights in regards to pay for overtime hours that were worked, and that we had rights regardless of our either sexual orientation or once again, our immigration status. The way that we were treated was very transactional. They just asked us to sign here and we're never really given any kind of access to the documents that we were signed. It was just for them important that we put our IAN number for taxes so that we would become liable and responsible for the majority of the cost to work there. As I said, we had various injuries at the place of work where I was out of work and I had to pay for the medical costs and was not given any kind of support from the company or any kind of sick pay or workers' comp. We were also told that because we were painters, that our skilled trade wasn't as difficult or as challenging. And we unfortunately aren't the only ones who have experienced this. And there's an entire workforce out there where they take advantage of workers because of their lack of immigration status, take advantage of us as Latino workers. But actually, this is more than just a Latino issue. This is an issue that impacts the BIPOC workforce, where they experience wage theft, misclassification, harassment, or are threatened because of who we are. This is also something that is not just happening within one company. This is an issue throughout the industry, and I'm very glad to see that this is being taken seriously, that our worth as workers and as human is being valued, and I'm really glad to share my story in order to address this issue, because it was very impactful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that story, Daniela, and the translation. So I want to point you all to the image you're looking at on the screen. Most people, when we think theft, we don't realize that wage theft constitutes more dollars of theft than any other kind of theft. So those other colorful ones, the yellow, the orange, the red, those are the typical types of theft we think of. All the rest of the green is wage theft. We've put in place some measures to deal with minimum wage violations. And so now here we're trying to deal with those other lighter green shades of wage theft. 750 million in legally earned wages is stolen from Colorado workers every year. Wage theft affects 1 in 10 workers. And as you've heard, it's especially impacting low wage immigrant and female workers. And 68% of low-wage workers in large metro areas suffered at least one pay-related violation in the previous week of work. That's a big deal. What we have also is some data that shows us that wage theft happens in every industry. We have some of our top violators listed here on this slide. Accommodations and food services, manufacturing, construction, and retail trade are some of the biggest ones. And we have one more story to close out illustrating this problem. And so I will pass it over to Edgar to tell us his story. Did I freeze up?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Edgar Jauregui, and I'm a representative with the Southwest Regional Council of Carpenters, and I'm here to share some stories about wage theft. I've been a representative for 3 years, and before that, I was just a regular worker like everybody else, and I've been in the union for 23 years, and I never ever knew nothing about this until I become a rep. It's amazing, this issue. I can believe it. I start notice it because people come up to me every time that I walk. I work several jobs every day, and I start introducing myself to them, and I start explaining who I am, and then people they need help. They come up to you. Once you start talking in Spanish, several people, I will say that 95% of the people with these victims, they're Hispanics. It's a racial issue too. They need help. I mean, they need help, and I've been helping them how to help them how to fill. What do they need to do? They need to fill up some forms and put complaints into the to the CDLE, and just kind of like guide them. What do they need to do? Because first of all, they don't know. They don't have the knowledge. The language barrier is difficult for them. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's really amazing, and it's sad because this kind of problems is it's affecting our communities. It's affecting our state because they're not contributing with taxes at the same time. when you guys have a project estimated on the city, they don't have the budget because people is not paying because they're by doing cash pay, it's easy to get stole. I mean, to get ripped off from these guys because they're not on payroll. So this is one of the biggest problems, and I don't think it's just on the city. I mean, this is the whole state, and we need to do something. We're working on the wage theft ordinance. I mean, I'll beg you to please help us to pass this. It's gonna help recover the money to the victims faster, and it's gonna have a lot of good things that is gonna help or communities or workers protect them and reduce this criminal actions in here in our state. Because like I said, I mean, it's affecting our economy, it's affecting everything. And like I say, I mean, I'm begging you guys, I mean, from city council members, please help with this ordinance for wage theft. Thank you very much for you.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you for all the work that you've done with workers and your work with this coalition. I will now kick it over to my colleague, Councilwoman Torres, to dive into the nerdy stuff.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Edgar, Danielle, and forgive me, Ernesto, for all of your stories and sharing some really personal information. I want to get into a little bit of what the actual ordinance includes. And because we did quite a bit of organizing and reorganizing of an entire section of the code. So what we did was revise section 58 of the Denver Municipal Code. And I'll just invite CdeBaca, who was our city attorney, to chime in at any point in these next few slides for any clarifying information. So there was already a minimum wage ordinance established in Denver that provided authority and oversight to the Labor Division of the Auditor's Office. And what we ended up doing was reorganizing the section that minimum wage was in to include civil wage theft language. And Division 1 covers the things that they have in common. So that is common definitions, employer responsibilities, complaints and investigations, enforcement and penalties that are common to both appeals, private right of action, and rulemaking. So if those were all true for minimum wage, they stand true for civil wage theft as well. The next two sections are where they differ, where they may be unique. Division 2 will cover language specific to minimum wage. Minimum wage provisions did not change. They did not get modified from what's currently in place for minimum wage. They were just reorganized so it's easier to follow. Division 3 is the section that is new to the code. So we cover language specific to civil wage theft that may be different from minimum wage. Next slide. Great. So this is an administrative pathway. There already is a criminal pathway. There already is a private right of action, state protection. Even the city passed, Anshul drafted before he came to council side, the criminal wage theft provision. What we were seeking to do was a layer below that, administrative, which makes it easier for employees who may not be able to get an attorney to follow their path through a more formal process. And it helps turn over the actual payment to the worker much more quickly. So we acknowledge the criminal wage theft path, but also recognize many workers would face barriers with some of that formal legal process. So we already have a labor division. Jeff is representing director of that division for the auditor's office for any questions about either how they currently enforce minimum wage, how they kind of foresee implementing these bills, this bill. But this creates a clear path for an administrative process. The goal is not to slap a criminal penalty necessarily. It is just to ensure workers get paid, and there's a path to do that. So why would we want to do that? So workers are owed promised wages for labor performed. I think that's a standard that we should all be able to agree upon. And why workers wouldn't be able to avoid paying owed wages simply by classifying a worker as an independent contractor. That's what we call misclassification, rather than as an employee. And to clarify, it's not all contract disputes that should become civil wage theft disputes. The ordinance is limited to cover only independent contractors working for employers who have employed several independent contractors to perform similar work. So this would ensure, for example, that a restaurant isn't sued for wage theft because it hasn't paid its plumber, but it would provide a path for various workers, whether they're wait staff, cleaners in the back, who have all been asked to come in as independent contractors, and they're doing the work similar to somebody else within that organization. One of the unique things about this process as well is what's called up the chain accountability. So this ensures workers are able to recover owed wages, even if their direct employer is insolvent or has disappeared. It would incentivize companies to contract with truly reputable contractors, which we know is the vast majority of the case throughout Denver. We're talking about those unique cases where we may have a bad actor who doesn't plan on paying their employers, maybe wasn't local, and has really left individuals in the lurch after work was completed. So this is definitely to prevent wage theft from the start. It also protects high road employers from unfair competition. Other places have passed similar up the chain liability or accountability laws, including state of Maryland, Massachusetts, District of Columbia, California, New Jersey, New York, Nevada, Oregon, and more. So this becomes one of the, I think, really important features of what Denver is trying to put in place. And I'll pass it over to Councilwoman Sawyer.
All right, thank you, Council President Torres. So let's talk a little bit more about and get down into the nitty-gritty details. So when we're looking at this policy, what we really wanted to do, our North Star, was to ensure that our workers are getting paid for the work that they do. So, you know, we wanted to make sure that the auditor's office had flexible penalties and the flexibility to be able to work with employers. So, you know, if there's a mistake or something like that, that is you know, easily remedied. That's not what we're trying to go after here, right? What we wanted to do was make sure we built in flexibility for the auditor's office to be able to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And the reason for that is because we see, based on the current experience, anecdotally with wage theft, but also in the auditor's office now with minimum wage violations, that you know, there's really a difference between a good faith mistake and an organization that is repeatedly doing the same things over and over again. So the auditor's office has the ability to order 3 times stolen wages, job reinstatement, a fine up to $25,000. And then there are fines for failing to certify payroll or providing false information to the auditor's office. Retaliation obviously is not allowed. But the authority to enact stiff penalties serves to deter those violators, right, in the first place, which is what we're really trying to do here. But we want to also make sure that the auditor's office has the discretion to encourage cooperation and not unduly punish errors that are accidents or unintentional. So our goal is to get folks to the table, to get people paid, and to make sure that our workers can, you know, pay their rent, put food on the table. We talk so much in our community about, you know, how can we address homelessness and stop it before it even begins. And this is one of those really important ways that we have found to be able to do that. So next slide, please. So this policy establishes a private right of action as well. Why do we want to do this? It gives our workers options. If a worker would rather not go to the auditor's office, they still have recourse, and I think that that's important. But a worker can choose to bring a civil action in court rather than via complaint to the auditor's office. But that only applies to the direct employer. So the up the chain liability that we've talked a little bit about earlier does not apply in this case. Next slide, please. Thank you. So who does this apply to, right? It doesn't apply to state agency, governmental agency, municipality, municipal corporation, quasi-municipal corporation, school district, irrigation, drainage, reservoir, conservation company or district. We're really talking about any employers who are operating within the city and county of Denver, and that could be any of the number listed here. Next slide, please. All right. And then what if there is an honest mistake? So we talked a little bit about this before, right? Our goal here is to get our workers paid for the work that they have done and what they're owed. Penalties are at the discretion of the auditor. And that is really intended to penalize people who are intentionally withholding wages, people who are not cooperative or not cooperating, who maybe disappear, or who are not willing to fix issues within 30 days. Jeff, wanted to ask you, maybe this is a good space for us to talk quickly and have you chime in. What are the policies and procedures going to look like and that process within the auditor's office?
Well, we're in a real advantageous situation right now because we have had notice of this, and we're also not starting from square one. So we do have rulemaking procedures in place, both existing through the city and working through the clerk and recorder's office. We had those procedures when we created the rules for minimum wage. We have an outreach program in place. We have an education program in place. We have existing staff in place. What we need to do is modify some forms and change some workflows. But this is something we can put in place very quickly. But one of the important things is whenever we're doing something new, public input is huge. So when we addressed minimum wage and we talked about the rulemaking, actually operationalizing the policy that's being created by council, we asked for public input. And we got great public input on the minimum wage, and we were able to really get ahead of some of those problems that may otherwise have affected us. Most, if not all of the rules that we use every day are published on our website. If you go to the denverauditor.gov, you will go to Denver Labor and go to the minimum wage section, and you'll find the starting point for the rules that we'll use for wage theft. What the big difference will be is that the initial threshold of determining whether or not someone can prove that there was wage theft will rest on the person making the complaint. Where in the past, we're able to look and see whether or not someone wasn't paid the minimum wage. This extends to anyone, to all workers. We'll just need a slightly bit more information to establish what their rate of pay should have been. And if, of course, someone was paid nothing at all, we'll be right on top of that.
Awesome. Thank you. That's very helpful. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Jeff, this is another question that we hear a lot about. So what happens when an employer has violated both minimum wage and wage theft?
So I think you were very bright in articulating that there are people who just make legitimate mistakes, business errors. So if someone makes a minimum wage error, we have the discretion to not fine them or to give them some education. We're always going to recover the money for the worker. That's the number one thing. We're always going to make sure workers are paid correctly. But if there is a person or an employer who's doing legitimate wage theft, not only do we have the right and the discretion to make sure that they're fined and that the full breadth of penalties are applied, if we believe that a criminal intent is in place too, we will work with the city attorney's office or the DA's office to make sure that criminal punishment is sought as well. In most cases, that intent isn't there. And so we try to just focus on getting the worker paid.
Fantastic. And then before we go to the next slide, I have had a question in our stakeholder outreach and a number of conversations about collective bargaining agreements, alternative dispute resolution. So wanted to just ask you to touch base on that really quickly. And so, you know, if there's an ADR process that's laid out for an employee, can you talk a little bit about how that's addressed and when what will happen then?
Yeah, so and Ansel, please correct me if I'm misinterpreting or there's been a change in the draft. My understanding is that there must be a contractual or administrative existing remedy be used. So before we take a complaint from someone, or if we get a complaint from someone and they are subject to collective bargaining agreement, they'll need to show us that they went through that process and the employer is not following through with the outcome of that process. So they went through the arbitration or mediation process. There was a determination and the employer is not following through with that before we can. We don't want to get in the way of, you know, honestly bargain for agreements between workers and their employer.
That's fantastic, Jeff. I really appreciate that feedback. I think, you know, a lot of what has kind of come in our conversations with stakeholders and a lot of questions have really come in that space between the policy that's written in the legislative document, right? That's going to go into the Denver Revised Municipal Code, and then the place where there are rules and regs that happen with the auditor's office, right? And so a lot of the questions that we're getting are sort of around how is this going to play out in real life? And I think we'll probably, when we get to the Q&A section, get a few of those questions as well, but wanted to just, and you sort of briefly touched on it earlier about, you know, creating those rules and regs and taking feedback from community members and stakeholders on that. But just wanted to give you an opportunity briefly if you wanted to kind of talk through that a little bit more in detail, or if that's something you want to really just answer specific questions on, that's okay too.
I can give a little bit of overview with it. I think it's important to have that rulemaking process and that the rules are much more living documents. The law should state the policy and the goals of that policy and a very broad outline of how that should be done and who should do it. But as laws change, as our community changes, our needs change, as the workforce changes, it's important to have a little bit more flexibility. And so long as we're following those processes that the city requires and rulemaking and notice and those kind of things, we're able to meet those changes. A few that come to mind are things like you may look at a bill when you're at a restaurant and it will say that there is an additional charge for the back of the house staff and how we affect that, whether that's compensation or gratuity, travel time, when the state or federal law changes. We don't want to have to go back to council and ask them to make a change when it's something that is just simply happening in the community. And it's more of a how do we do our job approach to things. And we're pretty flexible about that. And we will actually be looking at the minimum wage rules mid-January as well. So we'll be doing a little bit of rulemaking both with this and with the minimum wage at the time.
Thank you for explaining that a little bit more thoroughly. I really appreciate it. And then for the final of our slides, can you just talk a little bit about how a worker could file a complaint, please?
Yeah, so we're going to use the same system that exists right now for minimum wage. Again, just the threshold and how that evidence is collected will be slightly different. We may ask a couple more questions on a wage theft claim versus a minimum wage claim, but you can go to our website and there's a form you can fill out. You can call several numbers that are on our website. You can email any of our staff and we'll make sure that's routed. You can email me and I'll make sure that it goes to the right person. You can go to our office and file a complaint as well. We truly try to be as open and available as possible. We are multilingual, so we are able to accommodate every language. So we have a staff right now of approximately 28, and those 28 individuals, I'd say slightly more than half of them speak Spanish or another language, but we also have technology that allows us to speak to any individual in the community, regardless of their language.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, well, with that, I am going to kick it back over to Council President Torres to talk through the legislative timeline, and then we will go to questions and answers. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Councilwoman Sawyer, and bravo on getting through all of that talking while you've been sick. Good job. So the timeline that we've got mapped out, this is our second and final informational town hall. The first is posted on the website for the policy, which we will share in just a couple slides. We will share this one on that website as well, so folks can see both any new discussion. We weren't able to get Jeff on the previous town hall, so we want to make sure folks are able to hear his responses by posting this one. So we'll get that up as soon as possible. And then we are planning to go to FinGov committee next Tuesday, which is December 6th. We will evaluate this week if there are any changes, any recommendations that were made while we've been doing outreach that we need to consider, and then file in order to be on that agenda. That would put us, we didn't want to hold public hearing, which we will be doing a courtesy public hearing. We didn't want to do that right around the holidays, so we pushed this out to January filing. So we anticipate January 3rd being our first reading, which just publishes the bill, and then January 9th, which is our second and final reading, which would include a courtesy public hearing. So that's the legislative timeline, which means there's still a good month to engage with us, to let us know what you think, to make sure that we've got the right angle on this, that we've got your questions answered. All of those things, I think we want to make sure that we've been able to hear that so that we can build the right policy. And just want to thank, before we move it to any questions that folks have, just want to thank Jeff and his team for being such a great sounding board. It's been really valuable, I think, having the agent who would implement and enforce be a part of this conversation. And folks, just remember, this is a multi-year conversation. When Council President or Councilwoman Gilmore started this off in 2019, that builds on the work that the Office of Financial Empowerment had kicked off as well, in collaboration with a number of other partners. So very glad to start to see this moving forward. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in to find out more information. We will open up for any additional questions right now. And we've been answering some in the live Q&A, but I just want to refer out, yes, Mark, so when will council vote on this? Is it at the second reading on January 9th? Yes, that would be the final vote to pass or oppose this bill. January 9th would also include the public hearing component. So keep that date on your calendar if you wanted to talk to council about the bill and to find out what the final outcome is of this particular bill. John Milowski, missed the first part of the webinar. Can you touch briefly on wage theft? I understand minimum wage. John, one of the things that we're going to make sure we're going to be able to do is post this webinar online so you can see all of the information. The PowerPoint is already there, so you can take a look at what that piece will look like. Minimum wage is unchanged, so I'm glad you already know what that entails. Civil wage theft, really briefly, it'll empower the auditor's office to take complaints, be able to investigate those, and it will be able to move up the chain of accountability in a particular project. I see John has an additional question in here. What is the budget for this bill in order to make it budget neutral? So unlike the state, we don't do fiscal notes on legislation, but we have been in communication with the auditor's office about whether or not they will be able to accomplish this with existing staff or if they'll need additional staff. And our anticipation is they will need additional staff, which is a budget conversation that we will be looking to engage with our budget and management office after the passage of the bill. Jeff, did you want to cover anything on that piece on what you're anticipating the workload looking like?
I did a little research thinking about this meeting today, and I went to the Bureau of Employment Statistics with the federal government. And currently the number of employees that my office now covers, or my division now covers, is about roughly 190,000. So 190,000 workers right now is what we cover with the prevailing wage, city contracts and contract to minimum wage, and then the minimum wage. We will increase to about 800,000, so 4 times that amount of covered workers. Now, not all of them are being underpaid or be making complaints to us, but we do anticipate there will be a need for additional staff. I think one of the unique things that our office does in comparison to other labor organizations around the United States is that we do assess fines, and we do go through a collection process. So we never want to use fines to justify a budget. That's not the way that fines should work. They really should be a stick to make sure that people are doing what they need to do. We always try to use that carrot first, but it is something to make sure that people are compliant. But we will be able to assess fines, which will have a marginal, hopefully a small effect on the budget effect.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff. I don't see any additional questions. This isn't your only opportunity to ask questions. If you want to go back and take a look at the material, please feel free to email us. All the co-sponsors are collaborating and sharing information. So we will be able to answer any question that you toss our way. Councilwoman Sawyer.
Thanks, Council President Torres. I did want to flag a couple, I guess one other question that I've been hearing a lot in stakeholder outreach and meetings with stakeholders that I think is important to share and clarify, just as long as we're going to be posting this online, and we've got Jeff here. So there's been a few questions about bankruptcy, right? And so, after COVID, we saw that a number of businesses declared bankruptcy and their workers were not paid. Although we look at it and talk about wage theft and workers not getting paid in general, I wanted to ask Jeff just for clarification, if you don't mind, when it comes to, a business filing bankruptcy versus what we're talking about here with our wage theft ordinance.
Yeah, absolutely. So we would be subject to the determination of the federal bankruptcy court. So if for some reason that employer files bankruptcy and its employees are discharged, we would have to follow the rules of the court. However, we see that very, very rarely. What we end up seeing is people refusing to answer us, or people disappearing, or businesses not having an address, or not having a registered agent. And so that's a much different situation. Where we can address those problems is through some of the up-the-chain liability, through requiring good management from general contractors or from the a benefiting party. We can still, we don't believe that people are going to start just declaring bankruptcy and disappearing because they have this kind of claim against them. If there is a legitimate claim of bankruptcy, we will have to honor the court's determinations in those things. But for all the other situations where an employer is just simply evasive, we will make sure that those employees are found and paid correctly.
That's great, Jeff. I appreciate that. And I think it's also important to note that if an employer declares bankruptcy, they're put in receivership. It's a federal issue, and the receiver then has a sale of assets and reorganization, and workers are generally paid, all outstanding liabilities, including wages to workers, are paid via the sale of those assets. So it's a different situation than what we're talking about here, I think, and it's important to kind of flag that for some of our stakeholders who may have some concerns about that.
Yeah, and where the city may be considered a creditor in those situations, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, we would not be a creditor that could be easily discharged. So if we were owed because of fines that we assessed or some other claim, we would be a creditor in that situation as well, and not so easily discharged.
Really appreciate that clarification. Thanks so much, Jeff. And thanks, Council President Torres. I just wanted to make sure that we address some of the big things that I've been hearing about in stakeholder conversations. So thanks so much for giving me a little flexibility there.
Perfect. Absolutely. And I want to thank our colleague, Councilman Flynn, who's been watching our webinar and who just chimed in with his thanks and his support early on. So I look forward to bringing this to the council with all of my colleagues here. John is back in the Q&A here about, and Jeff, this might just be kind of a overarching opinion about minimum wage. He states, I see Denver continues to increase minimum wage that is now up to just under $16 an hour, right? It's $15.87. Yet now the market is way above this wage. In reflection, should the governor be engaged in mandating minimum wage versus letting the market adjust its accordingly? Do you have any comment on that, Jeff?
No, my office doesn't create the minimum wage. It's at this point set by the Consumer Price Index, which is, we were pulled from the feds on that. Same with prevailing wage. You give us a law and we'll enforce it.
All right. Thank you so much, folks. This QR code will take you to the landing page for this wage theft bill, which will have the documents that we've presented tonight, as well as the prior webinar, and we will get this current one uploaded as soon as possible this week. And any questions that you have, feel free to contact us via that website with any additional clarifying questions that you may have. I just want to thank our speakers this evening, Colorado Jobs for Justice, providing interpretation, to our co-sponsors who are on right now, Councilwoman Sawyer, Councilwoman CdeBaca, Councilwoman Gilmore, and our steadfast attorney, CdeBaca. Thank you so much. And I'd just like to thank our staff. My aide, Katie Heidemann, who is my policy aide, has been instrumental in making sure that we get to this point. But I know every single one of our offices, our staff have been involved. So thank you all, and thanks to the coalition of supporters that have been with us over the past 3 years. Thank you all for attending. We are ending just a few minutes early, so appreciate your time this evening, and we look forward to seeing you in the coming weeks.